"You're so big, that won't fit," she whispered, and the alien man just smiled. The whisper hung between them like a fragile glass filament, half joke, half admission. It came out of Salana the way breath does when someone holds a memory close and lets it loose to see what it will do. The scanner in her hands was absurdly heavy compared to the delicate slot in the rock. An instrument built for human proportions, clumsy against Veera's curving living architecture. Nirth watched with pale, wave-like light rolling along his shoulders. His smile wasn't human. Its meaning threaded through the moving patterns across his skin. It was neither mockery nor pity. It was a knowledge that had outlived the species who had named him. The ship glided above the canopy, its shadow sliding like a cloud across leaves that refracted starlight. From the bridge, Salana saw the world breathe. Turquoise growths that shimmered in the low gravity, bands of flora that hummed a chord when the wind moved through them. Veera did not simply exist, it performed. Every approach was an act of listening. She felt, as always when they drew near a new world, the simultaneous edge of her own insignificance and a rush of professional hunger. This was the mission she'd spent 10 years shaping, a first concerted attempt at ethical contact, a model built on observation and respect rather than extraction. Jack stood by the loading ramp with his hands tucked into his jacket, a posture she knew by heart. He wasn't watching the planet, he was watching her. The old familiarity twisted in her chest, a small, private ache, like a bruise you notice only in certain lights. They had been partners once. Laughter over shared coffee, debates laid into the lab night, a comfort made from routine. Then something had shifted, an argument that could never be unspoken, a refusal to leave a town, a promise not kept. He'd been reassigned as mission security and engineer when the proposal won funding. They both wanted the mission to succeed, but there was now an electric, unspoken ledger between them. "Suit up," he said when she moved to the ramp. His voice was controlled, the kind that tried to be professional and landed somewhere like trembling steel. "We take the southern skiff. Limit exposure. Stay in calm." She smiled quickly, the kind that hides all the questions. "Limit exposure," she repeated, tasting the irony. Veera's light had always felt like a kind of mercy to her, throwing her into awe instead of calculation. "We came to listen, remember?" Jack's jaw tightened. "We came to study. Same thing when you're careful." Salana didn't answer, because words were brittle near a planet that sang. The crew moved with the easy choreography of long practice. Straps, checks, the brief hum of the skiff as its anti-grav plates engaged. As they lifted, she found a pocket of air and replayed an older conversation. How Jack had told her, once, he trusted her judgment more than anyone else's. How she had asked him to come with her into the proposal, and he had hesitated. The refusal had felt like the first small crack. They descended into a forest that seemed to have been painted with phosphorescence. Leaves caught and refracted light in living mosaics. Vines threaded themselves into harmonic loops that tingled when Salana's gloved fingers brushed them. There was a singing, low and layered, like distant voices tuned to a frequency just outside comprehension. It was not silence, and it was not noise. It was a presence. The cave did not announce itself. It opened as if by invitation, a mouth of basalt softened by luminescent lichens, walls that breathed light in slow pulses. The atmosphere inside carried a taste Salana could not name, metallic and sweet, like an idea when you first understand it. At the center of the chamber, a pool gathered starlight and refracted it into an intricate pattern on the ceiling. Her instruments recorded everything with the exactitude of human curiosity. Her heart did something else, something looser and less scientific, a nameless thrill. That night, under the shelter of mineral formations that sang when they touched them, they found Nirth. He rose from the pool like a thought realizing it was real. Not a man the way she would have expected, but not merely phenomenon either. Tall beyond comfortable measurement. A body shaped in long, graceful lines, with translucent skin through which bioluminescent patterns traveled like messages. When he moved his limbs, embedded filaments of light rearranged to form shapes that closely approximated breath and expression. His face, if it could be called that, held a calm that seemed to be older than the ship's hull. Salana's training told her to be cautious. Her hands calmed against her suit. The Alpha protocols called for a remote interface first, a sample, a test. But the cave air had loosened the cords of protocol. Something in Nirth's posture asked for less distance. He did not lunge, he did not threaten. Instead, he dipped his head, offering a small, folded blossom from some part of the cave garden. A glowing flower, with petals like spun glass, dim blue at its core, edging into warm orange. Gift and acceptance were the earliest forms of language on most worlds. She felt the ancestral tug of that truth. Salana reached slowly, permitting her gloved hand to hover. Nirth's patterns brightened in the act. There was a sensation, a warmth, like a pulse in her palm as she took the flower. The lit petals sat against the fabric of her glove. The scanner in her other hand hummed and recorded with cold interest, but it was the contact that mattered. Later, back at the ship, Captain Marek would call them reckless. But in that suspended hour, Salana learned that the cave's pulse synchronized with her own breath. The linkage, the energy she had first read on a diagnostic wave, was not a weapon or resource. It was a memory active as a network. When she placed the flower against her chest, the warmth in her palm traveled inward, and for a moment, shapes and impressions ran through her like soft data. A flood of winter light in a ring valley, the name of a river that sounded like singing, the idea of stewardship repeated in a pattern so old it was like a foundational script. Nirth did not speak in words, but the patterns on his skin rearranged, forming a spiral that she somehow understood as an invitation to learn. She closed her hand, feeling the small, vibrating pulse of vein and light. Consent had been clear, mutual, deliberate, with the crew's instruments watching, and Salana's voice steady as she recorded the data. The bond was an exchange, her curiosity, his offering. It changed the shape of her day. A week folded into an intimacy of small rituals. Each morning, Salana met Nirth by the pool. They traded knowledge in the only ways available. Patterns pressed palm to palm through a thin membrane that the cave provided like a translator. A flower left on a flat stone. A sketch in the condensation on the equipment. Nirth taught her to listen to the hum beneath the roots, to identify where the energy networks intersected, and why certain harmonic disruptions could pull life out of balance. Salana, in turn, showed him fragments of her world, a spinning hollow of Earth's oceans, the outline of human hands, the grain of laughter where people find a comfort. The persistence of wonder between species made her forget to quantify. What she kept measuring was the swell of something that might be called affection, or simply a deep respect. Jack watched from the edge of things, his presence a taut wire. At first he offered engineering fixes, dampeners for the conduit near the pool, sensor placements, a suggestion to reroute a power line. His input was practical and welcome. But as days wore on, he stopped asking questions and began tallying what he could control. He would sit in the observation alcove, eyes narrow, and watch Salana place gloved fingers against Nirth's forearm, an exchange that, for all its novelty, carried in Salana's body the same language as long afternoons of companionship. Sometimes he would step forward with a device, half offering, half reminder, only to stop when Nirth mirrored the motion with a gentle light pattern that seemed to say, "This is not for you." It was small things at first: a tightened jaw when Salana came back late from the pool, an anxious insistence that she wear her calm more often, a comment about needing more stringent quarantine if they were underestimating an environmental variable. He framed them as concern, and Salana tried to hear them as such. She told herself he was protecting the mission. She also remembered the way his voice had sounded the night he left a planet-side lab for what he called a better opportunity and never turned back. Jealousy is a slow architecture. It begins as a draft under a door and, if unattended, becomes a storm. Jack's drafts gathered into a plan, a gradual reconfiguration of what he considered acceptable. He stayed late in the engineering bay, soldering in the dim hum of machinery, studying the conduits that threaded through the cave. He ran simulations, not for safety but for leverage. What if they could bottle the cave's rhythmic energies, contain them, manipulate them? The simulation results read like maps of temptation: efficiency, power yield, the mathematics of control. He justified the numbers to himself as contingency. He told himself that securing the energy would protect the crew should something go wrong. Each calculation restacked the pieces of his past, being overlooked for promotion, years of quiet sharing turning into one moment of distance. The more he told himself he acted for the mission, the more his actions aligned with reclaiming what he felt he had lost. The crew argued in small professional forums. Ethics officers urged restraint. Academics made notes on the significance of a sentient planetary nexus. Salana pushed for a moratorium on isolation instruments and for an expanded observation plan. Jack argued for redundancy and an extraction contingency. He was not reckless in the beginning. He wore his rationale lightly, like armor you keep polished so no one can see the dents beneath. It was only when his private calculations showed a plausible path to take and extract, one that could be presented to higher command as an emergency measure, that the threads of his plan tightened into something real. The day he put it into motion, Veera was singing low and long, an enormous chord that threaded through the trees and into the bones. Nirth had led Salana deeper into a grove she had not seen before, an amphitheater of living stone where patterns of light spiraled up like running script. Salana felt like she had stumbled into a language lesson. Nirth guided her hand along a spiral formation of leaves. She understood in that moment that the energy network here was not a resource to be taken, but a living grammar explaining the planet's history. But Jack had loaded a box into his pack, a containment device he had fabricated under the guise of redundancy. It was compact by human standards, a cylinder wrapped in a mesh that would hold for only minutes, but minutes on Veera were enough. His plan required him to get close, to drop the device near the node in the amphitheater and trigger it, in the belief that a measurable sample could justify a new directive to mission command. He imagined the praise, securing proof, creating security, finally being recognized. The narrative of utility eclipsed the soundless pleadings that had begun to live in his chest. But Jack had loaded a box into his pack, a containment device he had fabricated under the guise of redundancy. It was compact by human standards, a cylinder wrapped in a mesh that would hold for only minutes, but minutes on Veera were enough. His plan required him to get close, to drop the device near the node in the amphitheater and trigger it, in the belief that a measurable sample could justify a new directive to mission command. He imagined the praise, securing proof, creating security, finally being recognized. The narrative of utility eclipsed the soundless pleadings that had begun to live in his chest. He moved like a man certain of necessity. The device clicked into place. Its casing hummed with a low, legal tone as sensors calibrated. He activated the containment field. At first, the amphitheater responded with curiosity. The patterning in the air shifted like a soft question. Salana, who was close to Nirth, felt the change like a hand on her back. She turned. "This is not a test," she said, but the words were already wet with fear. Nirth's light splintered. The pool stuttered in its reflections. The singing formations narrowed into a thin, high keening. The containment field did what Jack had promised in simulations. It drew, briefly, a ribbon of energy into itself. It did not take everything. It was not a species-harvesting machine. It was a human-made coil that touched a living thing and asked it, with bluntness, to comply. Veera did not comply. The planet expelled a response, a kinetic wave that rolled through root and stone. It was not violent as a human weapon, but it was irresistible like a tide. Instruments spiked, comms choked with feedback, and then the amphitheater's light uncoiled in a violent corrective arc. Nirth moved between Salana and the device with a speed that made her floor her breath. His skin flashed in concentric brackets, and for the first time since their first meeting, she read anger in those patterns. Not personal malice, but protective, a fierce guardian code. Jack was thrown against the rim of the amphitheater as if he'd been slapped by wind. The containment device wrestled with the planet's wave. For a few uncertain seconds, technology argued with living systems. Then the field collapsed under Veera's will. A last brittle sound made everyone on their feet. The device ruptured under the pressure. A spray of blue luminescence lashed out, catching crew suits with static like frost. Salana heard someone scream. Someone else hit the deck. Jack coughed and tasted wood smoke and the strange mineral tang of Veera's air. There is a clarity to betrayal when it moves from possibility to action. The crew ran for the skiff. Captain Marek was shouting orders, but voices blurred in Salana's ears until they narrowed to the single image of Jack on the ground, hands pressed to his chest where light had licked his suit and left patterns like scars. He looked up at her, eyes more human than she had seen in days, shocked, betrayed by the outcome of his own making. "You wanted to protect us," she said later, in the cramped relief of the ship, when boots had echoed away and the cave's song had retreated into a sufficient distance. He did not look like the man who'd installed dampeners with trembling patience. His face had become thin and immediate. "You were changing the rules," he said. "You were changing everything." There was not an appeal in it, only a fact declared as if that made it right. Salana thought of the flower in her palm, the one Nirth had given her that first night. It now sat in a containment box, humming with life, but dulled under the human lid. She felt the weight of two choices, one that would make her a better diplomat between species, and one that would turn living things into data points. Her hand hovered over the box then, but she did not touch. Consequences follow actions like a shadow that catches up on the other side of a door. The damage in the cave had been real but survivable. Some conduits had been disrupted, a small grove had entered a state of temporary desynchronization, but Veera, ancient and vast, was not broken. The mission, however, fractured. The command sent a directive to withdraw until a thorough review, and the crew returned to orbit with hearts heavier than their luggage. There would be hearings, statements, measured reprimands for Jack, and a complicated file of commendations for prevention measures that had, in the end, limited casualties. Jack was relieved of certain command privileges pending debrief, an outcome that satisfied few and hurt many. In the quiet of the ship's observation dome, after alarms had faded and the other crew slept or argued softly in compartments, Salana returned to the footage she had taken. The pool, the spiral leaves, Nirth's patterns when he offered the flower. The image of his smile returned to her as if it were not merely an expression, but an entire dialect. The smile had not been triumphant in the moment of her whisper. It had been something else. She saw how Nirth had watched Jack, how his lights had moved in a pattern of curiosity, then a bracketed warning, and then the fierce protectiveness that rose when the containment field ruptured. The language of Nirth's skin seemed to translate again and again into an ethic she had only been learning by immersion. The planet protected what it loved. At the hearing, Jack spoke with a steadier voice than she expected. He admitted he had acted alone, that he had believed the planet's energy could be contained if they were precise, if they had the right safeguards. He did not apologize with the humility she would have hoped. His pride had been manipulated by the need to fix, by a narrative that had made him the only possible hero. Salana sat through the questions, the recordings repeated and parsed. She felt that ache again, but now tempered by a fierce clarity. Love, she understood, did not justify harm. There were no movie endings for ethical mistakes. The majority reports sided with caution, a moratorium on extraction, a new framework for contact. Jack was given mandatory counseling and reassigned to infrastructure support on the ship. He was not exiled, he was not destroyed. He was left where he could think through what he had done. That felt right to her. Punishment without rehabilitation would have been merely another possession, another expression of human control. Salana requested a second assessment under a new protocol, one that required a deeper mutual exchange before any mechanical intervention was even considered. This time, the approach took months rather than days. They learned to read the patterns as words, turned the gifted flower into an anchor for an ongoing dialogue instead of a specimen in a jar. Nirth's presence became the pivot around which debates and decisions rotated. He was no longer a subject, he was an interlocutor. One evening, alone in the amphitheater where the device had ruptured, Salana found herself kneeling beside the rock where she had first tried to force a human instrument into an alien slot. The socket was not broken, it refused to accommodate. She set the clumsy scanner down and breathed in the chorus of this place. Somewhere above, stars caught in the mists of Veera's atmosphere. Nirth stood a respectful distance away, his light a soft answering chord. "You're so big," she whispered again, not to a device this time, and not to a joke about size. Her voice folded with the planet. "You're so big, that won't fit." The syllables were a confession, an observation, an apology all at once. The words were true in multiple ways. They referenced the physical impossibility of forcing human tools into the planet's living systems, and the larger truth that some forms of wonder exceeded the limits of human containment. Nirth smiled. The smile this time carried a history like sediment, patient, a little amused, and full of a melancholy that made her throat tighten. He stepped closer, not with dominance, but with an invitation. Salana raised her hand, and Nirth mirrored it, placing his palm near hers, no pressure, only contact that hummed with the same energy that had first connected them. She felt the pulse travel up her arm and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with instruments, that belonging need not equal ownership. The fit they contemplated was not physical alone. It was a matter of contouring their intentions to accommodate difference. Jack watched from the shadow of an overhang. He had been given supervised access to help repair the damaged nodes, and the work had humbled him. He'd spent long hours fixing what his pride had broken, hands fumbling with instruments that once felt like keys to mastery. Seeing Salana in the amphitheater with Nirth stopped him in a different way. His old impulses flared like a reflex, but were now tempered by the scars of consequence. He did not step forward. He remained there, a figure shaped by regret and the possibility of learning. "What happens now?" he asked, when Salana walked back, the night cooler than their suits. His voice had the thinness of a man unmoored. She looked at him. The planet's song threaded the air. "Now," she said, "we listen more carefully. We act with less certainty. We find ways to measure what matters that don't require taking the thing itself." She thought of all the things that had fit and not fit across a lifetime: relationships, careers, technologies. Some problems can be solved with tools. Others require a change of posture, an expansion of comprehension. Jack's shoulders slumped. He did not ask for forgiveness in words. He asked for a way to be useful again, and there are many kinds of service. "Teach me," he said, "if you'll have me." Salana hesitated, the sharpness between them like wind on glass. Part of her remained raw, but the mission had changed them both, had reshaped their interior geometries. She nodded. "We start by listening," she said, "and by admitting that some things are bigger than our boxes." The aftermath was not tidy. The debriefings aired in careful language. The public narrative condensed into headlines that did not capture the fullness of what had happened: human error, planetary resilience, the cost of feeling entitled. But within the small team, something more intricate took root. They created a new set of protocols that valued reciprocity. The flower, now held in a living terrarium that allowed it to pulse with ambient light, became a symbol in their daily briefings, a reminder that gifts were not trophies. Nirth continued to come to the amphitheater. He and Salana developed a shared ritual. She would bring a human story, a photograph, an old poem, and he would respond in light, teaching her new patterns for listening. The process changed her work in ways that would ripple outward for decades. Jack repaired the nodes with a care that bordered on reverence. He learned to restrain the impulse to correct everything, to let living systems find their own balance sometimes. The discipline of this restraint, itself a kind of honesty, started to heal something raw inside him. He asked questions now that did not come from a need to have the right answer, but from a genuine curiosity. He started sending small reports not as claims of control, but as records of learning. On one of the final days before their scheduled withdrawal, Salana climbed to the rim of the amphitheater with the glowing flower in a terrarium in her arms. The ship would lift them soon. Politics demanded a pause in the contact. Funding bodies wanted more assurance. Command structures needed time to craft policy. She understood the prudence behind the command. She also felt an ache that was both personal and professional. The knowledge that leaving meant a new set of hands would come eventually, hands that might not choose the same lessons. She placed the terrarium on a stone etched by Veera's light and unfastened the lid. The air inside smelled fresher than any lab her crew had known, a scent that carried harmonics rather than molecules. Nirth approached, watching. He did not take the flower. Instead, he touched it lightly with a tendril of light that issued from the patterns on his skin, like a gentle Morse code of care. The process changed her work in ways that would ripple outward for decades. Jack repaired the nodes with a care that bordered on reverence. He learned to restrain the impulse to correct everything, to let living systems find their own balance sometimes. The discipline of this restraint, itself a kind of honesty, started to heal something raw inside him. He asked questions now that did not come from a need to have the right answer, but from a genuine curiosity. He started sending small reports not as claims of control, but as records of learning. On one of the final days before their scheduled withdrawal, Salana climbed to the rim of the amphitheater with the glowing flower in a terrarium in her arms. The ship would lift them soon. Politics demanded a pause in the contact. funding bodies wanted more assurance, command structures needed time to craft policy. She understood the prudence behind the command. She also felt an ache that was both personal and professional, the knowledge that leaving meant a new set of hands would come eventually, hands that might not choose the same lessons. She placed the terrarium on a stone etched by Veera's light and unfastened the lid. The air inside smelled fresher than any lab her crew had known, a scent that carried harmonics rather than molecules. Nirth approached, watching. He did not take the flower. Instead, he touched it lightly with a tendril of light that issued from the patterns on his skin, like a gentle Morse code of care. The process changed her work in ways that would ripple outward for decades. "You're so big," Salana said once, quietly, and this time the words were neither accusation nor jest. They were a recognition. "You're so big, that won't fit." She let the phrase unfurl into the amphitheater. It was a gift to language, to the idea that sometimes the right response to largeness is not to confine it, but to build a relation that approximates it. Nirth's light folded into complex shapes that felt like agreement. He did something Salana would later translate for a report as a closing gesture. He released a ripple of pattern outward, one that nested with the flower rather than capturing it. The ripple traveled through roots and leaves and into the soil, a slow, audible chord that the crew's instruments finally captured with humbled precision. It did not pull the flower into itself. It did not shatter the terrarium. Instead, it shared the plant's rhythm with the amphitheater in a way that made the enclosed breath of the flower part of Veera's song again. When they lifted, Veera's canopy slid away beneath them like an immense living ocean. Salana watched the planet under the glass of the observation port and felt the smallness of her human hands without shame. Some things, she had learned, were meant to be met with open palms rather than grips. In the months after, debates about contact ethics grew louder across the networks. The mission's files became a case study for restraint. Jack's name appeared in transcribed panels, in some with critique, in others with understanding. He took the criticism in public and the quiet work in private. Salana returned to a life that moved between public lectures and patient work with the International Ethics Board. Her reports emphasized listening as a method and humility as a practice. There were nights, for years, when she would close her eyes and see Nirth's smile ripple through the dark, and in those moments the phrase would come back to her and settle like a small stone in the palm of her thought. "You're so big, that won't fit." The line had been a hinge in her life, a literal jest about instruments and a deeper truth about the limits of human containment. Sometimes she would wonder whether history would call that moment a failure or a lesson. She had learned to prefer the hum of a planet that corrected itself to the false comfort of control. She learned, too, that people could both err and atone, that a person like Jack could inflict harm and yet choose a path for reparation. The little terrarium with the flower eventually found a home in the museum annex under the new protocol. Not an artifact, but a living participant whose caretakers consulted the patterns of Veera before any change. Visitors asked whether they could touch it. They were shown how to listen instead. Years later, when a new team prepared to return under the stricter framework Salana had helped create, she stood once more at a viewing port and watched Veera spin in its quiet glory. She felt the tug of old ache, tempered by a long patience. Jack sent a terse message. His work on the infrastructure had been published, and he would attend the new council meeting in an advisory capacity. He had lived with consequences long enough to want to be better. Salana pressed her fingertips to the glass. Somewhere in the amphitheater, a light pattern might be looping through leaves in a language no human could wholly translate. Somewhere, a being with the patience of seasons would continue to smile in ways that could mean nothing or everything. She did not need the answer to be simple. "You're so big," she whispered again to herself, a benediction now, and the memory of Nirth's smile came like a reply. It was a complex, tender thing, not triumph, not resignation, but a quiet peal of recognition. There are things in the